The Digimon TCG has been changed forever once again with the update to the ban and restricted list targeting a bunch of cards. But because this list does not take effect until a couple of days from now, there are still going to be tournaments in the current BT10 format. So we need to talk about the best and worst decks, not only for right now, but for the future of this game. And that brings me to today's tier list. I have a tier list not only for the current BT10 format pre-restriction, but also for the post-restriction BT10 format. And as always, we've got our tier 1 decks, the best decks, tier 1.5 decks, the second best decks, our rogue decks, the weird decks you wouldn't expect to be good, but sometimes are, and then the tier 2 decks. Yes, they are the worst decks, but they are still viable and really cool. But instead of me just giving you all my opinion on these decks, we're also going to leave it to the Twitch chat to vote on where they think decks should go within these tiers, and I'm either going to agree with them or disagree, and that's where the card or deck will actually be placed. I honestly can't wait to talk about the present of the Digimon TCG as well as the future of the Digimon TCG with all of you. Be sure to smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos like this in the future. And if you ever want to be a part of awesome live streams like this in the future, be sure to follow me over on Twitch. Link is down below. All right, with that said, our first deck is going to be pre-restriction Crossheart. We still got 4 copies of X4. Chat, where do you think this deck goes? Type 1, 2, 3, or 4. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 87% of y'all say it goes in tier 1, and given that it is and probably will still be the boogeyman of the format, I have to agree. It goes into tier 1. I do also want to point out though that it's not as dominating in the format as I initially thought. The change from best of 1 in Japan to best of 3 here in the US does do a lot of work for other decks on this list. But Crossheart is still crazy strong, especially if it draws all the pieces it needs to when it needs to. Speaking of downright combo decks, that brings me to the next deck on this list. We have pre-restriction Alphamon. Where does Alphamon go, everyone? Type 1, 2, 3, or 4. Not as dominating as Crossheart, but we still have 68% saying that pre-restriction Alphamon is tier 1. And once again, I gotta agree with the majority. This to me is still one of the strongest OTK decks, one of the strongest combo decks. The ability of Alphamon or Yukin just to dominate a board and then generate so much free advantage for you can go so long, no matter what deck you're playing against. To me, this feels like the true 50-50 deck of the format. Sure, your good matchups aren't that crazy, but your bad matchups are still kind of winnable most of the time because of how consistent and strong your cards are. And until we get the actual limitation of Doro Greymon, I don't see this deck going anywhere. It is still going to perform and do amazingly in tournaments. Speaking of performing well, we have the recent DC1 first place finish deck, Armor. Oh, and out the gate, tier 1.5 is dominating. So normally decks within tier 1.5 are decks that are strong, but maybe have a bad matchup to other really high performing decks, and that can kind of hinder their ability to actually win tournaments. They can still perform really well, but winning tournaments is a little harder to do. 57.6% think that Armor, aka Armor Rush, aka Armor Beatdown, goes in tier 1.5. And once again, this is going to be super lame, but I 1000% agree with you guys. Martin Lee's performance with this deck really showed off the powerful aspects of it. My personal favorite is its ability to either match tempo with its opponent, as in be the aggressor, or slow down. Gather a bunch of advantage with Tamer cards and go for some really strong late game turns that can create so much advantage in your favor. So I'm a big fan of this deck in terms of its matchup spread and the potential like skill / power ceiling it does have. So tier 1.5 feels like a really safe rating for it in my opinion. All right, up next we have my baby, my son, my child, my best friend, whatever you want to say. Chat, where does Black War Greymon, aka Gaiomon, go? For the sake of this video and this tier list, we are rating red base Black War Greymon, not black base Black War Greymon. It was a tight race, but with 44.2% My chat thinks Black War Greymon, aka Gaiomon, is a tier 1 deck in set 10. And I want so badly to agree with you. But I think you guys are overrating the power of Tamer removal right now. Yes, against Crossheart, it's hilarious to get rid of their Mikeys, get rid of their Zenjiros or whatever. But the amount of times that actually impacts them significantly enough to win doesn't actually make the matchup any better or worse for you. I will say, though, against the same BT9 decks that are still super strong in BT10, like Alphamon, like Metal Garurumon, Black War Greymon has its ways to play against them, and it's always going to have a shot at winning those matchups. The biggest problem I have, though, when it comes to analyzing this deck is comeback potential. I mentioned how I really like Armor because it seems like it can always match the speed or catch up with its opponents throughout a game. Black War Greymon, if you're not already ahead, it's kind of hard to come back into a game, and the best you can kind of hope for is a really powerful red color turn where you like wipe out your opponent's entire security and win via Blitz Omnimon, which the deck just isn't designed to support as consistently as it should right now. Don't get me wrong, in the future, when we get BT11, Black War Greymon will be the best deck, and I cannot wait, but right now, for me to call it tier 1 would be an absolute lie. I love this deck. I will always play this deck. But for right now, tier 1.5 feels like the most fair rating I can give it. All right, Bloom Lordmon, where does it go? All right, so chat says Rogue tier is the way to go. And I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. And Bloom Lordmon is a tier 2 deck with one simple word. Death Exmon. Because everything in set 10 is playing 1 to 2 copies of Death Exmon, even if they're not purple or black, Bloom Lordmon kind of gets a big shaft because it just isn't fast enough to come back from something like that in the mid to late game, and sometimes it can play into it way too quickly when it's trying to build its board up and get the actual big power turns from Bloom Lordmon. But don't worry, green fans out there, we still have post-restriction / pseudo post-EX3 to talk about for Bloom Lordmon, so you could definitely see a different take later on in the video. Where does Blue Flare go? This is the fastest moving one yet! You all have a lot of strong opinions about Blue Flare! I'm not gonna spoil where this is going, but could people who are typing tier 1 please explain? The final vote is tier 1.5, and you know what? We've just had a bunch of disagreements in a row because I'm gonna keep it a stack with you guys. Blue Flare is a rogue deck. I know it's not an obvious rogue pick because normally rogue decks are decks people would not expect to do well, and a deck like Blue Flare, a highly supported set 10 archetype that has a ton of powerful cards and a ton of good matchups. We're going to get to some really good matchups later on in this stream for Blue Flare, but in all honesty, you guys, I don't know how this deck wins games if it doesn't draw Metal Greymon on like turn 3. I just do not see it right now. It doesn't feel like the most consistent deck in the format. It's blue, so it has access to crazy, crazy strong cards. But why on earth would I play this deck over playing something like Crossheart, like Metal Garurumon, like even Armor instead? Because those decks to me have very clear lines to how they win, and they do them as fast or as slow as they need to. A deck like Blue Flare kind of lives or dies by its ability to defend itself, either by freezing your opponent's Digimon or by straight up having Magnamon X Antibody plus the X Antibody option card to just slow the game down. But unlike a deck like Armor or other blue decks, those are not as reliable as you would think. So until we get some major changes with this format from the restriction list or the inclusion of EX3, I personally do not see Blue Flare doing much of anything, and if it does, it will be a shock. That's why it's in Rogue tier. Up next, we have one of my favorite new decks that come out of the BT10 format, Jessamon. Where do we think Jessamon goes, chat? Tier 1, Tier 1.5, Rogue, or Tier 2? The final tally is Tier 1.5, 50% of the votes. And you know what? Y'all are right, but I'm going to add one better and say that Jessamon is the king of tier 1.5. So we're kind of getting the theme that I'm coming from when it comes to the tier 1 decks versus the tier 1.5 decks. In my opinion, the tier 1.5 decks are the decks that can respond really well, they have powerful plays, and they're kind of the more mid-rangey decks of the format, whereas tier 1 are sort of the combo, aggro, lightning fast, try to kill you and be as efficient and consistent at it as possible type decks. Both are equally strong and both can do super well in tournaments, but one definitely dictates the pace of the game a bit more. And while Jessamon does have some of the most powerful burst turns I've ever seen, it's always, here's everything I'm doing. If you have an answer, you win. If you don't have the answer, I win. And sometimes decks have the answer, whether that's Alphamon being able to blow up all the actual threats and then get rid of everything else, or just win by itself, or it's decks like Grandis that can just rest all the blockers and kill you anyway, or it's decks that have Crimson Blaze or Death Xmon and you didn't have access to Solarmon or ways to protect your big wide board. So as strong as Jessamon is, it still struggles to outpace the really aggressive decks in some instances, even though it can do just as many powerful things as them. Let's rate Mastemon on a scale from 1 to 10. Smash or pass? I'm just kidding. I mean, tier 1 or 1.5. Go. 41% say tier 1.5. And again, y'all, I'm gonna have to say you're wrong on this one. Mastemon's a rogue deck. It's definitely better, though, than Dark Knightmon, in my opinion. To me, unless you're a die-hard, good player who works hard to lab Mastemon and figure out every minute decision you need to make against all of your matchups, it just feels impossible to consistently perform with it. Well, yes, the deck is strong, it could easily win, it would take a miracle sometimes for you to do it. All right, chat, where do you think Metal Garurumon X Antibody goes? The former king of BT9, the best deck unarguably throughout the entirety of BT9. Where does it go in the brand new Set 10 format? The majority says tier 1. I'ma do y'all one better and say this is the king still of the Digimon TCG. And you know what? Let me just put it this way. All the reasons why Metal Garurumon was a strong deck in BT9 are still the reasons it's strong now, but it also has tools now to deal with the control decks that it struggled against. Namely, Omnimon X Antibody from BT10 was a godsend for when you're facing against a deck like Security Control or a deck where their security could potentially stop you from going for OTKs. Super, super strong. That's all I'm going to say. This is still the king of Digimon and probably will be the king for a while. All right, we have come to the ending of the pre-restriction portion of the BT10 tier list, and the last deck we have to talk about is this one, Security Control. Where does Security Control go in the tier list? You know what Security Control is, you hate it. Where does it go? 64% of y'all say tier 1.5, and I'm gonna have to do a huge disagree and rate Security Control as still a tier 1 strategy. Yes, it has all these flaws with like going to time. It's not the best deck for like a pure Swiss tournament because one tie ruins your chances of winning. But Jiminy Crikey, if we're defining tier 1 as the decks people need to respect or the decks that dictate how fast or how slow the game is going to go, I cannot think of a better deck that goes, I am in control of this game, you are not, than Security Control. Well, yes, all of these decks in front of it, Alphamon and Metal Garurumon, have ways of dealing with this archetype. The inclusion of Venusmon and potentially more option cards like Granda Soul or various other yellow option cards you can just splash in here and constantly annoy your opponents is gut-wrenching. So this is the current tier list that I have created with my Twitch chat for the current pre-restriction BT10. Here is the tier list that my chat actually created, only based on the votes they did throughout this video. Compare and contrast these two lists as you see fit. But we are now going to enter the second half of this video slash stream where we talk about the post-restriction changes and how it affects the entirety of these BT10 decks. And I'm going to defer to you guys for a lot of these opinions because we're trying to predict the future. We're not really analyzing what has already happened. So that's a really big thing to keep in mind, is this section of the tier list is us foreseeing what we think is going to happen and not actually making a hard analysis of the format because it doesn't exist yet. It loses Sunrise Buster, goes down to 1, and Shoutmon X4 goes down to 1. What do we think? Crossheart post-restriction is a rogue deck with 41% of the votes. And I'm going to have to do a big disagree. I think until we get set 11 and the new lower cost Crossheart cards like X3 or whatever, this is a tier 2 deck, guys. Like, it's lost pretty much its entire engine. It's lost its strongest removal piece for these giant monstrosities that are going to be OTK monsters. And while, yes, the resource engine of the Tamer cards is still unmatched in late game scenarios, I just don't think it's enough. Again, this is just a prediction, right? We've never seen a post-restriction Crossheart deck. I could be totally wrong, but unless someone puts in the time to find replacements for X4 or some kind of better removal spell for the deck, like maybe Trident Revolver, I guess, but that still doesn't take care of the big monsters you have to deal with, I don't see this deck doing anything. Another big loser from the list. Where does Alphamon go with only 1 copy of Doru Greymon? Whew. All right, let's see what the final verdict is. 3, 2, 1. It's a tie between tier 1.5 and tier 2. Oh my gosh. And those are like really different. Like tier 1, like the gap between tier 1 and tier 1.5 isn't actually that big. The gap from 1.5 to tier 2 is huge. It seems really easy for me as the streamer just to split the difference and call it a rogue deck, I guess. But my take, guys, without Doru Greymon, this deck has no protection and it has no way to out-tempo decks, you know? Like, it has no way to burst damage out of nowhere. If all you're doing every single turn is praying that your 2 damage swing from Alphamon or Yukon is enough to close the game, you are vastly underestimating how many turns you have in a late game scenario. Yes, the advantage is still there. Yes, the big blowouts are still there, but without the powerful X antibody engine of Doru Greymon plus Dex Doru Greymon, I have no idea how this deck wins. Like, keep in mind, limiting the only Doru Greymon we have in Digimon right now also makes Dex Doru Greymon a terrible card. And that's all of your level 5s. So you have to completely rework how the deck plays and how it wins. And I just do not see how that's possible. It is a tier 2 deck, no question. So this next one is the restriction of Calling from Darkness. And what this is representing on the tier list is the entire purple color. So I'm just gonna let you know right now, my opinion of purple as a color, it's a tier 1.5 color. It's got powerful cards, the option cards are crazy, and the Digimon that can just loop resources or gain tons of value are unmatched. What are your thoughts on the entire purple color? And I'm gonna defer to you guys on this one. I personally do not have an opinion. Like, I don't think Calling from Darkness makes purple cards any worse. It just makes certain archetypes power ceiling go way down because they lack the ability to loop their most powerful cards. All right, so a lot of people are saying that the purple color is still a tier 1.5 color despite the restriction. I think I disagree because I think the future implications of limiting every future purple deck to only 1 copy of Calling is huge for the potential design of some cards, because unless they make brutally powerful purple cards on play or on Digivolve, the ability of this resource-based deck to win games, I think, falls super hard. But like I said, I didn't really have a strong opinion. This is a prediction, so I'm going to defer to the chat and keep it in tier 1.5. It's still a tier 1.5 color. It does cool things. Time will tell how big of a deal this restriction is. Because the restriction of all of these cards happens on the same day that EX3 should release here in the US, let's briefly talk about how the decks that get supported that we previously talked about now improve or disimprove or get worse. So we have D-Brigade, there is D-Brigade support cards in EX3, and then we have Bloom Lordmon, there is vegetation/plant support in EX3. The most notable one is Hydramon, which is a super awesome inclusion for this deck. Where do we think the EX3 bros go? And the options for this one are going to be a bit different. We're just going to say, do you think they are better or worse? Everyone agrees when you give new decks new support, they are going to get better. I would definitely agree with the Bloom Lordmon scenario. Hydramon makes this deck lightning quick and so much stronger. Easily going to be a tier 1 meta threat, at least in the beginning of the format. As more things become established, it might die off in popularity, not being the shiny new thing. But with the potential dropping of decks like Alphamon, the potential dropping of decks like Crossheart that we previously mentioned, I could see this deck performing even better with those bad matchups removed. When we go to D-Brigade, things get a little interesting. Well, yes, I will agree with you. The deck is definitely better than it was. You know, the rise in popularity of bad matchups like Metal Garurumon, like Jessmon, like Black War Greymon, like Bloom Lordmon doesn't really make me ecstatic to play the deck. So there is a potential that while D-Brigade gets stronger as a deck, it actually gets worse and goes to tier 2, even though it's technically stronger than it was in just pure BT10. But I'm going to stick with it as a solid rogue deck that's just a little bit stronger than its past incarnations due to the new cards. And finally, after all of these predictions we have for the post-restriction format and kind of the EX3 format for Digimon, this is the final list we got. Blue Flare and Jessmon both went up. Things like Black War Greymon and Dark Knightmon and Armor all went down because the, unpopularity or the dropping of Crossheart sort of gives them less good matchups. And yeah, again, this section of the tier list is a lot less analytical and a lot more predictory of what we think is going to happen. I'll be doing a proper tier list for the EX3 format once those new archetypes come out and become established. And there you guys go. That does it for mine and my chat's take on the current BT10 format and the potential BT10 format. Let me know what you guys thought down below in the comments. And as always, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace.